Hello, everyone, and welcome to this History Indoors talk. It's great to have you with us. Please let us know where you are joining us from. We do love to see people joining from all around the world. Whether it's from England or from America or from Australia. Please do um, let us know. It always makes us feel I don't know, happy. It's quite nice to see where people are from. It's quite a nice experience. But anyway, welcome to our History Indoors talks. If you have not been to our talks before, welcome. What we do is that we have a talk for 20, 30, 40 minutes, and then we have a Q&A afterwards where you can ask the speaker questions, and the speaker will be, hopefully, as Josh here, able to answer them for you, and there'll be a good discussion going on as well, and hopefully it'll be enlightening and helpful for you, our viewer. If you have missed any of our previous talks, do not worry, because you can find all of our talks on YouTube. So please do go and check all of our previous talks. We've got talks ranging from the Roman period all the way through to the contemporary period, whether you love, I don't know, Roman histories, whether you love military histories, economic histories, social histories. You can all find it on YouTube. We have film reviews, we have short history videos as well. I mean, we have so much stuff that I can't do it justice. So do go check out our content. Josh, our speaker today, actually has given quite a few talks now, so you can find a few of his talks as well on our YouTube channel. So if you like what you hear, do go check his other content out. It'll be great to have you immerse yourself in that as well, and leave comments on those videos as well, because we can see those comments and we can respond to those comments as well. So please do get involved with all our past history talks and our past videos. Please do like and subscribe if you're here, because that helps us, helps our content, and helps our speaker as well reach the masses. I guess is the way to say, reach the vast masses out there in the world. But well, that's enough about History Indoors. You're not here, are you, to listen to me waffle on about a project which we have been going on for over 3 years, which I'm just gonna say is quite an incredible feat with over 1,000 subscribers. It's quite an incredible feat, and people like Josh here, Josh de Cruz, have been absolutely instrumental in that in this journey. Josh has been there hosting so many of our talks as well. You see him as a host in many of our talks, and he's given so many fantastic talks. So it's a pleasure to introduce to you this evening Josh de Cruz, who is doing his PhD at the University of Essex, and a valid and a important member of History Indoors as well. So that being said, I will disappear. I'll let Josh take it away and introduce his PhD and all about him, because I know I won't do it justice. I'll appear back at the end, but Josh, for now, I'll leave you. I'll leave them in your very capable hands, and I'll see you all on the other side.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you and welcome everybody. Yeah, my name's Josh de Cruz. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Essex. It's a history PhD, and it concerns the Eurasians of colonial Singapore. And this talk is part one of a two-part talk looking at the impact of sport and the Eurasians of colonial Singapore. And really, my argument is, well, hopefully it's going to be an interesting, a visual, pictorial argument. And so in light of that, and in line with that, my first slide is a poem. And this poem is by Sir Henry Newbolt. It's a Victorian classic, and it was an extremely popular poem, at least well into the middle and second half of the 20th century. And let's begin. So, there's a breathless hush in the close tonight, 10 to make and the match to win, a bumping pitch and a blinding light, an hour to play and the last man in. And it's not for the sake of a ribboned coat or the selfish hope of a season's fame, but his captain's hand on his shoulder smote. Play up, and play the game. The sand of the desert is sodden red, red with the wreck of a square that broke. The Gatlings jammed and the colonel dead, and the regiment blind with dust and smoke. The river of death has brimmed his banks, and England's far, and honour a name. But the voice of schoolboy rallies the ranks. Play up, and play the game. I won't read the last verse, but what you've got here, if you like, in the first verse, you've got sport. In the second verse, you've got empire. And what this poem's doing is connecting the two. So you've got the same qualities of character that makes you a great sportsman, and they're also the same qualities that makes the British Empire what it is. And it's the intertwining of the two, and if you like, how that's been transmitted, received and accepted is what I'm going to start talking about this evening. And here we've got a visual, if you like, personification of those qualities of heroism and sacrifice, those qualities of the imperial myth, if you like, that created or allegedly created the British Empire. And such was the power of that myth that the British believed that it could be transported, if you like, from the imperial centre, the Mall in London, all the way to the far reaches of the empire. And not only that, that those imperial qualities would come to be shared not only by the imperial rulers, but the colonized people as well. And here we can see that, and this is from a magazine published in Singapore. And what this shows us is the Strait Settlements War Loan. It's an advert. It's trying to encourage people in Singapore to contribute towards the cost of the First World War, and not just Singapore, but what it calls the Strait Settlements. And the Strait Settlements was the administrative part of British Malaya that included Singapore. So British Malaya was not under exactly the same system of imperial rule. You had the Strait Settlement, which was the island of Penang, the port of Malacca, and then the island of Singapore. And Singapore was by far the largest and most significant of the three, and they were under the direct rule of the British. And then you had, if you like, Peninsular Malaya, and you had what were called the Federated Malay States and the Unfederated Malay States. So they were under different types of British rule. And so for the period that I'm really going to be talking about, Singapore was part of the Strait Settlements. And so what we have here is we've got encouragement for the people of the Strait Settlements of Singapore to contribute to the cost of the First World War. And what we see is the figure of Britannia encouraging the imperial troops. And we can see there, if you like, a British Tommy and an Indian of the Indian Army going into battle together and as equals. What you may also see in the bottom left-hand corner is a battleship. And I believe that battleship represents the HMS Malaya. And the HMS Malaya was a battleship of the Royal Navy, fought in the Battle of Jutland, and was paid for by the contributions of the citizens of British Malaya, including the Straits settlements. So what we've got here is imperialism, or the idea, the British myth of imperialism, heroism, going from London, from the imperial centre, all across the world, all the way to Singapore. And not only is it through the martial virtues for military might, going back to that poem, sport. And we have, if you like, imperialism through sport, because as the British travelled through their empire, they took sport with them. And so through playing sport, through playing British sport, you can support the empire, and you can also, those same sporting values and games can be used to subvert the empire. And in the second talk, I'm going to be talking about maybe how they can subvert and challenge the empire. What I'm talking about mainly here is today is about how sport was used to support the values of the British Empire. And sport was seen as an inherently worthwhile activity. It was character building. It was like a rule book of morality, a proving ground, and it was, opportunities for social advancement were there if you were good at sport, especially cricket, if you like, the pinnacle of imperial sport. It was considered a proving ground, and if you were good at it, then prowess in cricket was of great value in terms of advancement and admission to higher social circles. If you like, sport served as a social leveler on the field, and not just on the field. You've got this idea of a level playing field, but also then in the interaction between the sportsmen after the game. And here we have, if you like, the pinnacle of imperial sport in Singapore. In the front of this picture, you can see some tennis courts, and there is the Singapore Cricket Club, which was established in 1852. And the Singapore Cricket Club is facing a field. You can see the tennis courts, and then there's a cricket field, and it's in the heart of Imperial Singapore. Behind it on the right is what's called the Victoria Memorial Hall, which was concerts, dances, that sort of thing. Where this picture is taken from is from the roof of a building that was the Supreme Court. So you've got this sense of sport at the heart of imperial society. And if you like, taking part in sport was considered a necessary antidote to the temptations and boredom of life in the tropics. And the club was the location where many of the unofficial, though no less significant, rituals of colonial life were performed. It was where the attributes of a muscular Christianity favoured by the Victorians could be displayed, a playground on which, as well as any battlefield, the superiority of the white race could be demonstrated. And its importance to colonial life in Singapore is shown by its location at the heart of the Imperial district, and the Imperial playing field there, the Padang, is bounded by administrative and judicial buildings, and also you've got the Anglican Cathedral as well. But as I've said before, as well as inculcating myths of racial superiority and dynamism, the virtues of sport, and especially team sport, also spoke of fair play and equality, and those values could undermine the same hierarchies that it served to protect. And the main hierarchy in Singapore in the colonial period was a racial one. And you had the Europeans on top, followed by the Eurasians, and then below them were what the British termed the Asiatics. So the Asians, which were Malay, Chinese, and Indians. Okay. What we have here is, I spoke to you just about the Padang, this imperial playing field, and it was also a location for other rituals of imperial life, demonstrations of power. What you've got here, you can see in the background, there's the Singapore Cricket Club, and this is a parade of the Singapore Volunteers Corps, and they're parading in honor of the Jubilee of George V. So it's also a location for demonstrations of imperial power. And what we have here is a picture of some sporting crowds, and these were as part of the celebration of the 100th anniversary, the centenary of Imperial Singapore in 1919, because colonial Singapore was founded by Raffles in 1819. And so again, we can see the juxtaposition of imperialism and sport, and the centrality, if you like, of sport to imperial life and ideology, because one of the ways that you would celebrate the centenary of British rule is through sport. And these pictures are taken, or some of the pictures are certainly the last picture and the war loan advert were taken from a magazine called the Eastern Illustrated Review, which was a locally produced magazine and was produced by English-speaking non-European locals, and was owned specifically by English-speaking Chinese in Singapore, who are commonly termed the Straits Chinese. And so what we can see is that these non-Europeans were embracing certain aspects of British imperialist values. And I mentioned that the Singapore Cricket Club, whites only, was founded in the 1850s. The Straits Chinese founded their own recreation club in 1884, but a year earlier, the Eurasian community of Singapore founded the Singapore Recreation Club. So a place, sporting club for Eurasians. And it's still there. It's no longer exclusively Eurasian. And this photograph was taken from exactly the same location as the photograph that I previously showed you of the Singapore Cricket Club. So you can see this is, if you like, the opposite side of this Imperial playing field, the Padang. And I think you can make out some football pitches there, and there's a cricket pitch as well. And the Singapore Recreation Club, you've got the Singapore Cricket Club, Europeans only. The Singapore Recreation Club is Eurasian only, so it's a communal club. And this idea of communal clubs were followed by the other ethnicities of Singapore. So it followed the pattern established by the British in the 19th century. So as racial segregation, if you like, was institutionalized in colonial society. And so you've got the whites only Singapore Cricket Club. You also have Singapore Swimming Club, again, whites only. And then for the other communities like the Straits Chinese, Indian communities, they all have their own clubs. Now, the Singapore Recreation Club was opened in 1883, and in order for young Eurasians to play cricket, because they couldn't play cricket at the Singapore Cricket Club. What you do have, though, is the fact that the two clubs are at opposite ends of the Padang. And this meant, if you like, this separation of the Eurasians and the Europeans facing off against each other, a separation that, if you like, emphasized the racial divide between them, but also it emphasized a shared enthusiasm for sport and the cultural and social values that came with sport. And this continued with the same off-field activities of drinks and card games in exclusively male environments. And certainly 100 years ago, the Singapore Recreation Club was the premier Eurasian club in Singapore. So, as I said, it was founded in 1883 by members of the Eurasian community to play cricket. The first pavilion was built in 1885 on the Padang, and then to accommodate increasing crowds, we've got this one from 1905, a newer pavilion, which was opened by the governor of the Straits Settlement, Sir John Anderson. So that in itself, I think, signifies the importance that Imperial society had for sport, and by not just the one community. And it was in the 1920s and the 1930s that really sport took on a hugely prominent role for Eurasians, and the club was expanded again in 1931. And people would come, play, watch a match after work, stay and chat, get together for drinks. Clubs would have dances. So there was a real social aspect to these sporting clubs. And this is the enlarged club from the 1930s. And it was paid for by its members, including my grandfather, one of the donators. But this was in contrast to the Singapore Cricket Club. The Singapore Cricket Club was expanded in 1922, and the government of Singapore loaned the club, the Singapore Cricket Club, $50,000. The Eurasian Recreation Club didn't get the same. They had to pay for it themselves. And so at the club, cricket, tennis, football, athletics, hockey, card games, billiards, drinks on a Sunday afternoon. But these were, both the Recreation Club and the Singapore Cricket Club, bastions of male chauvinism, men only. Women were only allowed on the premises of the Singapore Recreation Club in 1927, when members voted in favour of allowing, and I'll quote here, it says, members will be at liberty to invite lady friends to lawn tennis on Wednesday afternoons. So until 1927, women had to wait outside the Singapore Recreation Club for their husbands or fathers to finish having the time of their lives. And it was only in 1931, with this rebuild, that a ladies' restroom and toilet was actually provided on site. But even then, ladies weren't welcome in the evening, and they were restricted to certain parts of the club. Still, this was an improvement on the Singapore Cricket Club, where women weren't allowed even to play tennis. And even up until the 1980s, some parts of the Singapore Cricket Club, I think they had a male-only bar, so there was still this divide between the sexes. And there was an annual general meeting of the Singapore Recreation Club in 1938, and that rejected women as members. And the following year as well, the members of the Singapore Recreation Club voted to keep the Singapore Recreation Club as exclusively for male Eurasians. Now, what Eurasian women felt and did about this, and there was a reaction, will be explored in my next talk, in the next part of this talk about sport and the Eurasians of colonial Singapore. But here we can see proper English gentlemen, English stroke Eurasian gentlemen from two Eurasian sporting clubs from the Strait Settlements, the Singapore Recreation Club and the Penang Recreation Club. And this is in 1928. And the guy sitting in the front row with the hat is somebody, a very important man by the name of Conrad Hercules Clark. And the cup that these two Eurasian cricket teams are playing for was donated by Conrad Hercules Clark. And this man is a hugely influential figure for Eurasian sport, for the Singapore Recreation Club, but for sport in Singapore in general. And in the interwar period, which is my main focus, he was the preeminent sponsor of sporting competitions, not restricting himself just to Eurasians. And this excerpt from the Sportsman magazine in February 1933 counts 53 trophies donated by Conrad Clark to sporting associations and schools, including the Singapore Recreation Club, the Girls Sports Club, the Raffles Institution, the Chinese Swimming Club, and the Amateur Athletic Association of British Malaya, to name a few. And they're also for a broad variety of sports, which indicates the range of sporting activities taking place at the time: cricket, tennis, billiards, athletics, football, hockey, netball, and badminton. But what I'm going to speak about, and probably what the most important trophy he sponsored, was the Clark Challenge Cup. And this was in cricket, and this was an annual match between what were termed Europeans versus the rest. And these games took place annually between 1924 up to the eve of the Second World War, 1941. And it was the intention of Clark, and in this he succeeded, that this Clark Challenge Cup, the Europeans versus the rest, from 1924, and what it did is it brought locals to prominence in cricket terms. And most of the rest initially were Eurasians. And when these matches began, they started initially, there were one innings each game. And then the following year, it was a 2-day match. And as its popularity and importance increases, it became a 3-day game. Now, these matches mainly used players from the Singapore Cricket Club for Europeans and the Singapore Recreation Club for the rest. Although the first rest team, if you like, the first 11 of the rest team included a member of the YMCA and the Ceylon Club, and later on drew players from the Indian Association and the Straits Chinese Recreation Club. And there was keen rivalry, as you can imagine, in these matches. They received detailed coverage in the local press, and this edition of The Sportsman had, as part of its match report for that year's encounter, which actually ended in a narrow win for the Europeans, it listed all the results to date. And that thus far, there'd been a total of 2 wins for the Europeans, 1 abandoned match, 6 draws, and the first win for the rest took place in 1930. And the importance of that victory, really, at the most English of sports, cricket, a vehicle for transmitting the values of the Imperial ruling class across the empire, and its impact on Eurasians and on Asian self-esteem should not be underestimated. And it reinforced the belief articulated by some Eurasians and by Conrad Clark especially, that in the current system, and given a fair and free chance, that level playing field, Eurasians and Asians could flourish. And there was a tour in 1927, an Australian 11, including 7 test players, toured Malaya in 1927. And there was an outcry in the local press initially when the first match in Singapore was against an all-white, all-Singapore Cricket Club side. And Singapore Recreation members were subsequently included in that team and were part of the one victory that, or the one defeat, I should say, inflicted upon the Australians during that tour. However, the preeminent and most popular sport in Singapore, in the Straits settlements, in British Malaya after the First World War, was football. And the Singapore Football Association had been founded in 1892. The first league began at the beginning of the 20th century, and initially were made up of European and Eurasian teams, but from 1917 onwards, local Chinese and later Malay and Indian teams became part of this Singapore League, and the Straits Chinese football team won the league in 1925 for the first time. Now, what we have here is a photo concerning the HMS Malaya Cup. And this was an annual tournament that began in 1922 of the various parts of Strait settlements and British Malaya, the federated states, the unfederated states, a football tournament, the various Singapore, you've got Selangor here, Penang, playing each other at football. And the first tournament was in 1922 and was actually kicked off by a visiting, kicked off on the Padang in Singapore by a visiting Prince of Wales, Prince who the later King Edward VIII. And one other thing I want to mention here is the name of this tournament, the HMS Malaya Cup. Can you remember I mentioned earlier on about this battleship that had fought at the Battle of Jutland? And so once more, we've got this connection between sport and imperial values. So these football matches attracted big crowds, multiracial football crowds on the Padang numbering thousands. And the Singapore team of the 1920s included a Eurasian called Roy Smith, and his nickname was Thunder Shooter, and he played football. He was a centre forward, and he had a phenomenal record in the Malaya Cup, in this annual tournament, in the HMS Malaya Cup, I should say, from 1921 to 1927. He played 19 times for Singapore, including 6 consecutive finals. And in these 19 games, he scored 28 goals. And he was an all-round sportsman as well. He was an athletics record holder, a tennis champion. And in the late 1920s, such was his prowess that the Singapore Cricket Club decided to break their own colour bar, and they poached him from the Singapore Recreation Club. And the law, if you like, or one of the laws for Smith to get him across the Padang to the Singapore Cricket Club is he was given a job, the post of assistant at a big trading company called McAllister's. And this was a job usually that would only have been occupied by a European. So quite a moment. However, poaching a gifted athlete is one thing, and a meaningful desegregation is another thing. And even whilst this was happening, the Singapore Cricket Club was still imposing its colour bar elsewhere. And for example, a Eurasian journalist from the Straits Times, the local newspaper, was not allowed on their premises to report on their matches. But even so, by the late 1920s, and you can see in this picture, the Singapore football team was mixed. Had Chinese, Eurasian, European players, and by the late 1920s, it also had its first non-European captain, a Eurasian called W.A. Area of the Singapore Recreation Club. And so, a bit like the Europeans versus the rest, the importance of these sporting spectacles can't be overestimated. You've got a mixed team with a non-white captain playing in front of multiracial crowds on the Padang, the heart of Imperial Singapore, and representing the colony, representing Singapore. And by 1935, the Singapore team for this annual tournament consisted of 1 Eurasian, 5 Malays, 5 Chinese, no Europeans at all. And it wasn't just in football. In other sports, things were starting to change. The Malayan Tennis Championship in 1930 was held on the tennis courts of the Singapore Cricket Club, but was a truly open competition with competitors, Chinese, Eurasian, European, Japanese. Roy Smith was there. You had soldiers, captains, teachers, lieutenant colonels, reverends even, and there were men, women, mixed competitions. And so you can see that things maybe were starting to change. And what we've got here is, this is the cover of the Sportsman magazine, and I've been using pictures from there, and you can see the variety of sports that are being played in colonial Singapore at this time. And this magazine was, again, a straight Chinese magazine, but reported on all sports and all sporting activities by all the different ethnicities in Singapore. But it was still very much a respectable and loyal publication, as can be seen by this advert for a Chinese photographic shop in Singapore. And you can see in these various sporting pursuits that it obviously thought would find favour and interest of the readership. We've also got King George V and again the Prince of Wales, Edward, there amongst the dogs and the billiards and the aeroplanes and the sports cars. So things were changing, but also things were staying the same. And what we've got here, on the one hand, this is the rest team in hockey, because just like in cricket, you also had Europeans versus the rest at hockey. And there were also annual sporting competitions between the various states. And the Singapore hockey team in 1931 had Europeans and Eurasians only. And this was something that the Sportsman magazine was not impressed with and felt able to criticize. And I'll just read from their sort of editorial. It says, "We do not see any reason why, if a player who is clever and deserves to be included, should be barred because he is black or coloured. Sport, as we all know, is the only medium to foster international friendship and mutual respect." So they're criticizing the values, imperial values in terms of discrimination and racial segregation, but they're criticizing them on those values that are also allegedly part of British imperialism, those sporting terms and sporting grounds. So in some aspects there's change, in other aspects the change isn't coming fast enough. But I mean, here we can see this again is from the Sportsman magazine, and this is from a Singapore Recreation Jubilee Sports event. So this is where they're celebrating 50 years of the Singapore Recreation Club, and it could be viewed from those photographs, you could be believed that the Eurasians had surmounted the racial divide in sport and in colonial society. But things are never quite as clear as that. And this is just really just like a caveat to say this is a reminder of, you know, imperial power also comes and is maintained through the barrel of the gun. And here we have the police marching on the Padang for the Jubilee celebrations of George V. And so we have this thing where you've got the Eurasians and the Europeans opposite each other on the Padang, and that opposition reflects the divide between them, but also what they have in common as well. And we shouldn't underestimate the lure of these imperial myths, if you like, and the myth of fair play, the myth of the level playing field, because to a certain extent, we believe in them now and we want them to be true. And certainly every time we watch or play sport, we're hoping for equality, we're hoping for fairness. And I'm going to end really with a quote where you've got this dream of sport as the glue that binds the British Empire, an empire where the sun never sets. And this man, Sir Theodore Cook, is seeing it in its most positive and yet most imperial light, where he says English cricketers are playing against Parsis and Mohammedans at Karachi, while a team of Maoris are testing the best of our rugby footballers at home. By such threads are the best bonds of union woven. For the constitution of the British Empire, unexpressed and inexpressible, does not depend on force and cannot by the sword alone be guarded. It is the visible, intangible impersonation of spiritual sympathies and associations. It lives because the blood that is its life is pulsing from its heart in England through every tissue of the body politic in every quarter of the globe. So, if you like, that's the vision, that's the dream, and it's something that seduced many at many times and in many different places, but we'll come up against the reality a little bit more in my next talk. So I hope you found that interesting. Many thanks for listening. Yes, and any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and also if you want a further conversation, my email's there as well. But thanks
Brilliant.
again.
Thank you, Josh, for that fantastic talk. And again, something that I know little about, so to be able to kind of delve into that even slightly, just to kind of see what was going on in the 20s and 30s, and to see the differences in the sad stories as well, you know, of segregation and these things happening still in later on in the period. So I thank you for that. And so someone has just said, excellent presentation as always. It's always thank you, Colin, for that. And it's nice to have that feedback. If you have any questions, please do put them in the comment box. I'm happy to take them. Any and stuff. But I've got the first question because I'm the host. So also it gives you all some time to think about some questions as well. And I'm just interested by those two cricket grounds so close to each other, and like what's the legacy today? I mean, do they still hold on to those kind of stories from this period, or they tried now in recent times to distance themselves away from those stories of the 30s, as you said? They try to kind of move away from that. I mean, I can imagine there've been quite rivalries. Is there rivalry between the two grounds?
I mean, both. I mean, both were segregated in their own ways, and both, to a certain extent, were forced to desegregate in the, I suppose, what you would call the post-colonial period.
Yeah.
But they're both very proud of their heritage. Okay. And although certainly the official history, if you like, of the Singapore Cricket Club, to a certain extent, glosses over the racial discrimination. It doesn't completely, if you like, whitewash it, but it does gloss over it to a certain extent. But they are both still elite organizations in Singapore, and it's not, although on the face of it you can membership is open to all, there are it's not quite as straightforward as that.
Yeah,
and I mean, you've got to be very wealthy.
I was also quite surprised as well by the, like you said, that image of all those two cricket grounds, and then you've got obviously the theatre, I think near the Victoria Hall, wasn't it? He said, and then you took a picture from the Supreme Court, like all these very, very 19th century, early 20th century kind of infrastructure. And then behind it, you got all this kind of modern buildings as well, and almost just that kind of the difference between the past and the present, almost like it was just quite harrowing just to see. I'm not sure the word harrowing is the right word, but to see the complete contrast, and the fact they've kept that heritage, they've kept that history in those areas and haven't touched them. I just find that quite interesting. I mean, how's your experience going there? Did you feel that, or was it?
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it is incredible that sort of juxtaposition of the old imperial buildings. That also, bear in mind, those buildings were built by Indian prisoners brought from India for the purpose of building those administrative buildings. But yeah, the juxtaposition of those with the hugely incredible modern 21st century tower blocks, and it is really quite a thing to get your head around.
Yeah, exactly. We've got some comments which I'll just share, which we maybe comment on. It said many similarities with the way cricket was organised and constructed in the Caribbean, which I thought was interesting as well. Again, there's the similarities of sports, of empire sport being presented in different regions, but the same kind of structure and plan.
Yeah, definitely. And I know, I mean, Colin wrote an excellent book about Caribbean cricket called "They Gave the Crowd Plenty Fun," and it talks about the incredible significance of the West Indies coming to England and beating the English at cricket in England. And in a way, what I'm talking about in a smaller situation, the rest beating the Europeans also has, has an impact. And it doesn't, it's not even just purely a racial thing. I mean, think about the Ashes and how much you've got these white dominions like Australia, New Zealand, and the importance they also have of beating the English, the British at sport, and especially cricket.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge thing, isn't it, to do, and it's amazing, isn't it, how sport is used in this way to again, as you showed by those cups as well. And what was his name? Was it Clark?
Yes, Conrad
Clark.
Hercules Clark. Yeah.
Yeah, and his aim, I guess, to show that actually through sport, actually there are no differences, and in skill level, and that I think is fascinating as well, as in that regard.
And we can also see with the story of cricket, the change of the position of the British in the world as a major player to a lesser player. And we can see that in the way that Indian cricket now dominates cricket internationally, and the centre of cricket, the home of cricket, is, though, I mean, they still talk of Lords in London as the home of cricket, but really the new centre of cricket is the Indian Premier League.
Yeah, 100%. It's a massive industry now, isn't it? And you can see the popularity. Players even go out there now to partake in it, don't they? It's a huge thing. And again, it's one of those legacies, the legacies of empire that still there. Yeah. Just thinking on what we said, Colin just makes another point. There's a question we'll come to in a second by someone, but again, we see, don't we, this kind of segregation going across the empire in sport, which I think is important to note. So thank you, Colin, for your contribution. Maybe we should have got him here to host it. It'd probably been fascinating discussion, I can imagine, between the two of you. But we've got a question here. How did, was there any differentiation? Basically, we could expand this question and say, was there any differentiation between Europeans? Was there any class system within the Europeans in sports? I guess we could say.
I mean, the European, the Jewish community in Singapore wasn't really large enough to have much of an impact on sporting terms, but where they fit into imperial society, a colonial society in Singapore, is quite interesting, and they're quite ambiguous in a not dissimilar way to the Eurasians. On a slightly different note, I was in the National Archives last week, and I came across a file, and it was talking about, we're now in the Second World War, and it was talking about the internment of German nationals. So at the start of the Second World War, so this is 1939, the Second World War in Europe begins, and the Japanese don't invade mainland Malaya till the end of 1941. And so there's this sort of interregnum. And what happens is Germans are interred, and they're all placed on a small island off the coast of Malaya called St. John's Island. And anyway, there's these high-level discussions between the Colonial Office in London and then the Imperial colonial government in Singapore. about what do they do with the Jews, because you've got these Jewish refugees from Germany, these anti-Nazi Germans, and they're being stuck with the pro-Nazi Germans. They're all lumped together, and so there's this argument that isn't really resolved about how do you differentiate between the Jews and the other sort of Germans.
Oh, absolutely fascinating, and it'd be interesting, wouldn't it, as a study as well, to see the kind of, I guess, their experiences in the 30s as well, and especially in that period as well. That would be an interesting study. Again, if you're out there and you want to do that study, then please do. I mean, I've got another question if no one else has one. So if you've got a question, please put it down below. We've got another maybe 5 minutes or so please do ask away if you do. But I'm kind of, not necessarily shocked, but football seems to be slightly different in how it seems to have been run and presented. To you said, you've got a very mixed team in the Singapore team there. Is there any reasons why that is the case compared to, say, hockey, as you showed, or is it just because the people involved? Is it the individuals who ran it, or is there any reasons why it was like it was? Because it just strikes me a bit as a kind of an outlier almost. I'm not saying it was perfect, but it seems a bit of an outlier. And
I think it's more to do with the people that played it, because football was always more of a working class sport than, say, cricket or hockey, and I think for that reason, in terms of imperial prestige, I don't think it carried the same importance of a sport such as cricket. And so if the Whites got beaten by the locals at football, then maybe that could be put down just to the lesser quality of lower class Whites. Whereas with cricket, you're the best. It's the best of the best. And I think I mentioned it. It was being good at cricket was one way of social advancement, and that wasn't just sort of between the communities, but that was also, if you like, within the community as well. Okay. I mean, there's a story of again at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, of this doctor who's in transit in Singapore, and he plays in a scratch match at the Singapore Cricket Club and scores a century in this scratch match, and is then immediately offered a post by the chief medical officer of Malaya, who tells him that he's the kind of person that we need in Malaya. So so I think cricket has got, and being good at cricket has got a certain oomph that
so again, it's almost a hierarchy in sport, isn't there? There's a hierarchy in sport. Which links into our last question, which we'll ask, which comes back from Colin as well, which is a good question. He says black middle class clubs in the Caribbean refuse membership to perceive lower order black players. Did these class distinctions occur within racial groups in Singapore or Malaya as well? Was there class differentiations between, so he said the Eurasian community, for example?
Well, I mean, yes, to put it bluntly, there were class distinctions within each community. So really, each community, they all had their own sporting clubs. So you had the what were then called the not Sri Lankans, but it was the Ceylon Club, and that was for Indians from Sri Lanka. Then you had North Indians, Muslim clubs, you had Indian clubs, you had Malay clubs, you had Chinese clubs. Now, and you had Eurasian clubs. Now, the Singapore Recreation Club, it was Eurasian only, just in the same way, in a similar way that the Singapore Cricket Club was European only. And so these clubs, these sporting clubs in colonial Singapore, sort of internalized this sort of racial segregation. It took some doing to take them out of it. And it was only in the post-Second World War that the Singapore Recreation Club opened its doors to Chinese, Indian, non-Eurasian members. But what you've also got to remember is that there was a cost. So you had to be able to pay your fees, and and also, I mean, clubs at this time, you think about the clubs in London, and if you wanted to be a member of a club, then it would go to the vote of all the other members. And this idea of the blackball and people being blackballed and not allowed to join and weren't given a reason, or didn't have to give a reason why their membership was turned down. And similar things would be taking place in the Singapore Cricket Club or the recreation clubs.
Yeah, so there's still that
because they felt themselves as the best of the best.
Yeah. So there's still a hierarchy going on, even within these different groups. Is this hierarchical process that still takes place?
I mean, one of the best ways of breaking through these sort of barriers would to become like the thunder shooter Roy Smith and to be an exceptional sportsman. And then you know, it's to be that's a good way of getting past those sort of prejudices.
Well, thank you, Josh, for that, and absolutely fantastic answers as well as those questions. And thank you again for those who did provide questions. They were absolutely fantastic questions and comments, and especially Colin, thank you for your contributions there as well. We do appreciate that, as well as Alan as well for your questions. So thank you, we do thank you for your participation. Thank you everyone for being here. But special thanks to Josh for giving this talk, and I have an absolutely fantastic topic as well, and something that I think we do need to know more about in our public sphere. So thank you, Josh, for doing this and to educating us on this topic as well.
My pleasure.
As Colin has said, you got to write a book. So after your PhD, I expect to see a book being published. So thank you for that. Thank you everyone for being here. Josh is going to do a second part of this talk, hopefully in September. So make sure you keep your eyes out in September for part 2 of the talk. But we have got talks as well coming up in the next few weeks. So if you'd like to join those talks, please do. More welcome to come along. I'm giving a talk as well at some point, so make sure you're up there for that one. But until really next time, thank you all those who are here, and thank you, Josh, once more again. And we'll say bye. And we'll say bye for this evening, and we'll hopefully see you all very, very soon. So bye for myself and bye from Josh.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.